ありがとうございます。それではこのままですね、ディスカッションに、
Thank you very much. So we would like to jump in the panel discussion right away. So please sit on the seat, get on the seat. Thank you.
それでは今、お三方からお話。
Now we heard from three speakers, and our theme today is urban development and area management. So these two topics are to be discussed, and then we would like to talk about the future vision for cities. I mean, that's a theme very convenient for us in a way. So based on your presentations, I'd like to explore what are the common things, what are the different things between New York, London, and Tokyo. And also, I mean, Times Square is a very unique district within New York. So maybe as a common denominator, what I thought was Ricker and Michael were both saying that when we think about big cities in the future, there's always one theme that are common, that is what to do with the poor people, how to take care of these people in their living environment. And also in extension, this affordable housing is one thing, housing supply for the lower income people. That's part of the administration's responsibility. Actually, if you look at the city plan, we have to think about where to locate it, for example. So it's a very serious and important theme. That's what I thought as a common denominator. And also when we were listening to Michael, you were talking about Brooklyn. So within New York, it's on the east side. And how to take care of this district has been a very long-standing theme. And I had the impression that really the city and the people are serious about it. So maybe as a starter, including Tokyo, in regarding what we need to do about bigger cities, be it in London or New York and Tokyo, I think we have similar issues and challenges. But there is one thing different, that is, in the spring I went to London and actually went there to talk about New York city planning in London. And I was on the committee member along with Ricky, I think, and then so people were interested in hearing about New York. And outside of the country, we often talk about Tokyo. And now this is 2017, and what we're talking about is the development of Tokyo up to 2020, and also beyond that. So the span of the time is about 10 years. And I think in case of London and New York too, you have the same thing, that is a very rapid redevelopment. And now when we focus on the first 10 years and also the next 10 years, next decade, that is a decade after 2020, the theme for Tokyo and New York is very different. The theme for London and New York is very different because the demographic situation will be very different, because in London and New York, you are planning based on the assumption that due to immigrants influx, you will see increase of population. But in Japan, in Tokyo, I mean Japan as a whole, the population is going down already since 2011. But Tokyo is the only exceptional city. But then it's going to see the decline of population after 2025. So up to 2020, the assumption is very common across the three cities. But the conditions will be very different between Tokyo and London and cities. So with that in your mind, I think what was very, very impressive was the Central Park south side, the skyscraper, which Michael talked about. And I was really surprised when I saw it, because before, when people developed in 1974 a World Trade Center, that height was twice as high as the other skyscrapers at the time. But the Battery Park building was to be built next to it was to be half of it, so that the World Trade Center will stand out. I think that was a discussion happening at the time. And yet today, of course, in comparison with Lower Manhattan, the Battery Park has different landscape. But then the south of Central Park, maybe the sky is not the public realm. And so I was wondering what will be the future for the New York landscape or townscape or skyline. And another thing is, be it King's Cross in London or East End also in London, what's different between London and the other cities is in London there's a height control of buildings. And in a way, you are trying to preserve the atmosphere or whatever that has existed. I don't know what's exactly the reason, but in any case, you have certain regulations. So there is a certain regulation, right, about the height control. So my first question is, Michael, I would like to ask that question about New York, and also I would like to ask a question about London height control to Ricky, if that exists.
So I think, so let me take this off. So I think that let's talk about Lower Manhattan since you mentioned it. I didn't because I thought people here have probably heard a fair amount about what's happening there. But I do think what's actually happening in Lower Manhattan that is interesting is that that part of the city has come back to life in a way that has almost nothing whatsoever to do with the redevelopment of Ground Zero. Ground Zero was a political decision and an emotional one that was made in the moment. But in retrospect, in my opinion, it was a very unwise decision because, for many reasons, but above all because it completely missed what was actually happening in the city. That neighborhoods in the city, and this is true in Tokyo, it's true in London, and it's true throughout New York, the nature of neighborhoods was changing. The notion of a central business district and people commuting into this was dead. People wanted to live, as we know, in a mixed-use area. Lower Manhattan was being recolonized. People were moving in, businesses were arriving, and the thing that could have happened at Ground Zero, instead of building a series of an office park, a giant office park around a plaza, which is effectively what it is, a very 1990s model of development, what it could have become was the center of a booming new neighborhood, which Lower Manhattan is becoming despite what's happening there. So I answer your question a little indirectly because, yes, it is certainly true that a new group of skyscrapers are redefining the skyline there just as they are redefining them in Midtown, so that distinctive two-humped camel hump of the Manhattan skyline is going to look different, is going to be modified. But to me, the real change has happened on the ground, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with those skyscrapers. In fact, on 57th Street, and then I'll stop about this, but Ricky said earlier, the question is what happens with these buildings on the ground, and that is absolutely true on 57th Street. They're largely investment opportunities for foreigners who will buy these very expensive apartments. The building, 57th Street, is not a particularly nice place to live in principle. So the question is, what kind of neighborhood is being created by these new buildings? And again, I think the changes that are happening there are happening despite those buildings, not because of them.
There's also a question of who's going to live there, if anyone.
Right.
Well,
Okay.
so if I can go back to your very first point, which obviously connects to the previous panel and Sharon's life work, let alone what she just talked about. The city is profoundly political. And therefore managing urban growth, whether it's with tall buildings or low buildings, is about managing that interface. And accommodating growth is ultimately, it's a choice by the politicians, the people who are elected to represent us, is either making a city more or less equal. I mean, I think that's probably, you could say, anywhere in the world, a shared view. I think if one were to be a little bit cynical and skeptical of some of the work maybe we're all involved in, including all these global rankings, which I've been part of with you also, they hide the reality of what's happening. Let's take Paris, which was referred to. Paris is probably, of the advanced cities, got one of the biggest structural problems of any city I know. What is it? It's that the core, the center, is frozen as a piece of archaeology. It's a museum of the rich. Right? The average income is about 8 times higher than on the edge. Right? And on the edge you have people who are immigrants of a particular religious and color skin, living in, let's call it, Le Corbusier blocks without any public realm or social services. This is a city which is going to explode. So when I see your graphs telling us that Paris is way up there in terms of, global rankings, well, depends what you measure, of course. Now, the key point here, and to a degree, I'm here to respond and provoke. Why are we so obsessed with tall buildings? Why is this such a big issue in discussing the future of cities? I mean, I'm fascinated that even, I think Michael, Tim and I have talked so much about the grain of the city, the physicality and how it relates to its sociality, whatever that happens to be, that ultimately whether the building is tall or thin or has a pitched roof or whatever is part of the public realm of the city. I think that's fair enough. But I am concerned that those of us who are in a way engaging in this debate and informing our politicians, and to a degree also trying to restrain in the best way possible and channel private investors in such a way that, of course, you want people to make money, but give something back to society, design buildings so that they respect, and I think this is my point of our attempts in London, respect the DNA of what the physical grain is and what the social grain is, but not just now, in the future. Final point in relation to, let's call it the diversity question. Japan as a society and Tokyo as a city is much flatter than many of the other cities we're talking about, certainly New York. But if we were to look at Sao Paulo or Mumbai or other parts of the world, the inequalities are much more different. So the Gini index, as it's used to measure the difference between those at the top and those at the bottom, in Tokyo, happily, because of your very advanced society, are sort of flatter. Will it remain like that? Are the buildings and the investments that we've just seen actually keep that going, or will it actually make the differences more stark than they need to be? I think those are exactly the sort of issues that we're all grappling with. I don't think we've got it solved, but I think retrofitting with something which understands the grain of the city at all levels, physical, social, and political, is what, I guess, the new way of thinking is. And I have to say that very large, fat, thick blocks with black facades on the edges, because all the shops are interiorized, is not the way to create a vibrant city.
Okay. You had a comment?
I wanted to comment on this question of some of the similarities, especially economically, that we all face, which is, these cities all face, which is the fact that urban life is becoming more popular, and even with the demographic issues in Tokyo, assuming these cities stay safe, they are continuing to be places that people want to go to. And you have this supply and demand of, you have a finite amount of space, and you have more people going to them. And so the question becomes, how do you deal with these equity issues? How do you deal with keeping a city alive and interesting and authentic as it becomes more expensive? And is the only solution coming from a national government or some form of redistribution or adjustments to the market so that you can keep a certain amount of economic or other kinds of diversity? And I think that's something that may change over time in the United States as it becomes more urbanized. But I think that's a core thing that we have in common. As the world becomes more urbanized, there is this basic economic pressure of things getting more expensive because more people want to go to cities, and then how does that get addressed? The other thing I just want to comment on, which is a little bit related, is some similarities, initial impression of Tokyo about this really interesting mix of order and disorder. And visually at first it seems like there isn't a master plan to Tokyo and that there's a kind of disorder in what is there, but there is there is this amazing order within that disorder. And I think that whether it's Times Square or any city, there is this tension between order and disorder, and control and letting go, and market forces and civic purposes that I think runs through every part of what cities struggle with and face.
一つ
One question I have of Tim. Times Square, as you said, back in the 1980s, it was a dangerous place. People didn't want to go, whereas today it's crowded. And it has a major impact on the economy of New York City, you said. So 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I think people back then would be surprised with what's happening today. But now it's overcrowded, like Kabukicho in Tokyo today. So I wonder what's going to happen. What do you plan to do? Do you want this crowd to do something? Are you trying to control the inflow? So what's next?
One of the basic things was simply creating more space for people and saying, going from 37% of the space for people walking to 73% of the space and taking away from cars. And I think that'll continue to play out in cities everywhere. I don't think it's a matter of getting more people to Times Square, but it's this issue of how do you engage them in the public space and around the margins, times like midnight. But I also think that that's the larger challenge that other public spaces in cities face, which is as a place becomes economically successful, there are many people that still say that Times Square has sort of lost its soul. And it's this metaphor for, as a city becomes more expensive, how do you bring life and creativity to it? In many cases, arts are used as a tool by urban planners to bring life to vacant or unoccupied places. I think part of what we're experimenting with in Times Square is how to use creative people and artists and to help see a place in a new way and to bring life to it, and also not be so utilitarian, frankly, about using them.
But
Okay.
can I just add in, Tim, because Tim is forgetting to say that Times Square has become extremely crowded, and this is part of the problem. But the plan to pedestrianize and change it is half done or two-thirds done. And so it's still a construction site. So a lot of the hostility towards what's happened there is really not taken into account, that you will not see what this is going to be like. And I think even in some of the photographs that Tim shows where you have these tight sidewalks and traffic, this won't continue to look this way. So some of that problem may solve itself. And certainly the character of Times Square will change when the project is actually finished.
Thank you.
Can I just make two points on what Tim has said? I think so much of what you're describing is recognizing the importance of time, not in Times Square, time. That one needs to think of what happens from 6 in the morning till 10 or 11 or midnight, and throughout the year and throughout the week. And I think that's something that planners, designers have been very weak at in the last sort of 30, 40, 50 years. And that's, I think, coming back. That's one point. The second point is that, we're lucky, these three cities, that we've got the problem of congestion. Most cities in the world are facing depopulation or depopulation from city centers. And that's, of course, what the American cases, or Johannesburg, or places like that, where you have the empty center. I think the biggest challenge that we're all interested in here for Tokyo is, if the population is not going to grow enormously, but you are going to be adding so much volume, do you have the risk of having places that are not full? What actually happens to these spaces and how are they programmed? And I think the lessons of Times Square are very useful. But in a way, density and congestion is a good problem to have.
Right. ありがとうございます。この後お三方には
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to ask you to talk about what you think of Tokyo. But before that, we'd like to take questions from the floor. If you do have questions, please raise your hand. I think we have time to take maybe a couple of questions. Please state your name and affiliation, and please identify to whom you're asking the questions. Go ahead.
Very much. My name is Ana Maria Diaz. I am an independent professional living in Tokyo. Thank you all for the great presentations. They have been very, very good. This is a question for Tim. Of course, we are talking here about cities like Tokyo, London, New York. I was wondering if there's any type of request from governments or independent stakeholders from South America or Central America and cities like Bogota, Buenos Aires, Ciudad de Mexico, where they are growing very fast and also where they are trying to recover public and urban spaces where there are high rates of crime, and how are they, if they are asking for any type of cooperation, and if you are dealing with that right now or not?
Yes, it's very interesting. In fact, just a couple weeks ago at the International Downtown Association conference, met a woman named Diana Quintara, I think. She's the minister. The municipal government created a position of the director of the Authority of Public Space, which I thought was a radical idea. And in fact, she started off being someone who helped bring a biking program, a shared biking program to Mexico City. And some of the folks from Bloomberg are giving them advice about reclaiming public spaces. And of course, if you've been to Mexico City, it's a very car-oriented culture as well, but an amazingly rich and vibrant city. And I think what often happens is one needs to see a very specific example of change. I mean, in New York, it was recapturing a part of Central Park where a fountain was, or in Bryant Park, a small park in Midtown, and then people began to imagine the ways in which that could be a great community asset. So. And Mexico City is, an economic center and a connector for much of Latin America. So I'm very hopeful that Mexico City, which is one of the world's great underappreciated cities, can move along with these public space initiatives, these progressive transportation policies. They've got to deal with the safety issue in public spaces, which is the starting point for any of this. But I'm very encouraged.
May I add something to that? So we all know about the sort of transformational initiatives in places like Medellin and Bogota. Yeah. But I wanted to say something because it related to Times Square in reverse. When I was in Bogota looking at the Transmilenio, the rapid bus service there, which had been already in place for about 18 months, I discovered that it had actually really badly broken down. So here was something that was a very progressive initiative to create rapid bus service, which would link poor neighborhoods on the outskirts and provide a much less expensive and more easily created form of transportation than subways, which served lots of people. In fact, its success became its downfall because too many people began to use it. And Tim, Times Square is dealing with also the success. The key lesson there, though, and it's true in Medellin as well with some of the initiatives that have taken place, is follow-through. Because what clearly had happened in Bogota was that you had one mayor who begins this program, puts money and effort into creating it, but then there's no follow-through by further governments, and then the initiative itself comes to seem like a failure. So this long-term, Ricky mentioned time. It's also, this sense that time is needed to follow through on these projects over many, many years. Otherwise, they will all fail.
So just the same mayor, Enrique Peñalosa, is going up for election this coming weekend in Bogota. So we'll see who's right.
Yeah. The mayor who obviously initiated this and then lost partly because of the failures of Transmilenio.
So it's going to be interesting.
And I think one of the things, to Michael's point, is this is a place where the private sector and the civic sector can play a role in bridging and sustaining these initiatives when the political fashions change. Mm-hmm. And I also think that in New York City, I've seen tremendous growth and innovation in public-private partnerships, mostly focused on public spaces, which have also struggled recently because there isn't a philosophy about these public-private partnerships. There isn't a philosophy about public space management. And so government is now just trying to control, it's going back to those early ping pong games of trying to control what happens rather than nurture those things.
はい、他どなたかまたご質問ございますか？あと一人は大丈夫ですかね。
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? No other questions? If that is the case, as I have said, from the three gentlemen on the stage, we've been speaking about the future of the cities, and in the discussion today, I felt that what we do with the transportation system, like the subways and the suburban railways, or maybe bicycles and walking, is another choice. And in the case of New York and in the case of Times Square, public square is something that is very important within the town planning. And this is something that Tokyo lags behind in, how we can make use of the public squares. This is something that's very interesting for us. I would like to make a comment about this. And finally, you each have your own subject topic that you're tackling. And based on that, when you look at Tokyo, how is it going to be in the future? Your personal comment. How do you feel Tokyo is going to be? It can be critical. It can be positive. Good points, bad points about Tokyo in 10 years or in 20 years. How you feel about the future of Tokyo? I would like to ask your comments from each one of you. How, from this side or the other side? Where do I start? From all of you? Then
Critical comment, but wasn't meant as criticism, but as a word of warning and sharing a concern that one has to be very careful in creating new envelopes. One is very careful about thinking about how those envelopes are going to be used both inside and outside. And I think the scale of change that your city is embarking in is admirable, but there is a sort of question in my mind about how they're going to be animated and how they're not going to, let's call it, tear the city more apart than it is now. Because one of the wondrous things, which was referred to previous speakers, is this, organized mess. It's magical. The fact that you do have taller buildings along the main streets, and then you're just 1 or 2 blocks away, and there is, not only is the scale different, the sound is different. People greet each other on the street, they say hello, they're very polite to each other. It's very different human behavior, and I think that dynamic is something that certainly London doesn't have, and therefore as the city grows, it should try to do everything possible not to lose that. I'm only going to say one thing about the Olympics. Make sure it fits into the bigger plan of the city.
ありがとうございました。じゃあ、ティムいかがですか？
I mean, I love this city, and I feel that New York has so much to learn from it, and I love that organic energy that comes, and the surprises that come around every corner, and that process of discovery that happens all the time. I worry. It sounds like it went well in London, but I worry about the potential of something as big as the Olympics to be another destructive force if not done in a thoughtful, strategic way, whether it's in the focus is on the north or the south. And the main, it's not a problem to be solved, but I think the main opportunity is that in Tokyo relates to these, not even a public square, but these sort of slices of public space, whether it's reintroducing bike lanes, more systematically, bicycles more systematically into the roads, but how you create these communal spaces, these places where the alchemy of urban life, where these the mixing of different elements produces something new. Where and this only happens if I think there is an influx of immigration, where the tension and the friction of a city, where different elements mix together and that produces something creative. How you can nurture that conceptually overall for the city, but also in these little pockets of public space that connect the buildings, small and large, throughout Tokyo.
ありがとうございました。じゃあマイケルさんいかがでしょうか。
Yeah, I mean, I can't. I've been 3 times. I can't pretend to be expert about Tokyo. I mean, I think the things that fascinate me is a kind of includes a kind of built-in obsolescence, which can be very destructive, and yet seems part of a kind of ongoing life here, which creates evolving neighborhoods. I actually imagine, but I don't know this, that there is a very intense and lively network of neighborhoods, far too complex for an outsider to understand, and that there probably is a kind of street life which may not happen in the kind of squares that we are familiar with from London and New York. So I would not guess that there are not adequate public spaces. I would just say the city isn't shaped the way New York is, and to me that's an enormous asset. I did notice a couple tiny things. I did notice that you give tickets to bikes that are left parked on the sidewalk, and yet it seems to be illegal to leave your bike, and people drive on the sidewalk even though they're supposed to be in the road. I find this interesting too. I think you haven't quite worked out maybe this relationship of the bike and the car and the pedestrian, and this probably will evolve as well. And I actually am impressed by this complex because in most cities a complex like this would not be a lively place. Maybe it's the density of Tokyo that allows this to be a place that's so kind of wonderfully as confusing as the rest of Tokyo and unpredictable. But I have to end, as everybody else does too, with this interesting challenge you have. You have a shrinking city and homogeneous culture. This is not generally the path towards the kinds of global indexes you were talking about. I'm not sure a global index is a very interesting metric, but I can't myself see how you reconcile these two things. So that seems to me the larger challenge, to figure out what kind of identity Tokyo wants to have.
ありがとうございました。まあ今日は本当に
Thank you very much. Within a very limited time, we have had a very fruitful discussion, and all of this are going to be very useful for the future of Tokyo. Please give them a big round of applause. Thank you.